The next day, John was there again with two of his disciples. When he saw Jesus passing by, he said, "Look, the Lamb of God." When the two disciples heard him say this, they followed Jesus. Turning around, Jesus saw them following and asked, "What do you want?" They said, "Rabbi, where are you staying?" "Come," he replied, "and you will see." So they went and saw where he was staying, and they spent that day with him. Over the past 2 to 3 years, I have found my head turned and my heart caught by the transformative glimpse of God I have experienced through Christian community. Like the two disciples, I have felt this glimpse feed a deeper curiosity, prompting me to follow and ultimately be invited to come and see. To this end, this 2023, I am embarking on a 6-month journey to dwell with various Christian communities. On the way, I'll be sharing interviews with community members, founders, and leaders to learn more about the blessings, challenges, and wisdom these dwelling places of God hold. In doing so, I hope to inform how it is we might nurture people and communities to be transformative manifestations of God, offering a glimpse of the divine and inviting people to come and see God's loving dwelling place.
I am Demarius Walker. I am currently in Indiana in the United States, and I'm the program director for an Episcopal Service Corp program at Trinity Church, an Episcopal church here in Indiana. I feel like that's enough.
Cool. Thank you. And you've had incredibly extensive experience living in community. Would you mind summarizing what that experience is?
The first word that came to mind was like, I don't know, masochistic. But that's a joke in the sense that I do love community. So I've lived in several different communities, 3 through the Episcopal Service Corps. So 2 of these different sort of year-long communities in Atlanta and 1 in Washington, D.C. And then afterwards, I went to live the community of St. Anselm, which is based at Lambeth Palace in London. And afterwards, I went to Corrymeela for a bit, which is in Northern Ireland, the Peace and Reconciliation Center, and sort of a volunteer community there. And then, and this is, I mean, it's sort of an intentional community. I went to seminary at Virginia Theological Seminary, and during my time there, stayed for about a year with Holy Cross Monastery, which is in upstate New York. And now I'm here. Well, actually, there's a little bit more in between that story, but I think that's what you're asking.
Thank you. And I find the Episcopal Service Corps really fascinating as a thing, a body of communities, and got very excited when I found out about it. Would you mind describing what the Episcopal Service Corps is?
What a great question, and particularly because I'm currently on, I think, as you know, on the advisory council for the Episcopal Service Corps, the sort of national board, which oversees these, and we're having a lot of conversations right now about what is this thing called the Episcopal Service Corps. So the conversation is sort of up for grabs, and maybe talking with you will help me with some of those conversations. But the Episcopal Service Corps, in short, is a year-long year of service. So usually young adults, age 20 to 35, live in community together somewhere in America. Usually these are programs that are attached to a church or a diocese. So these folks live for a year of service. They work at a nonprofit that's connected to the program. That's the service aspect. And then the programs are very different depending on which one you're talking about. So there are different levels of praying together, of eating together. All programs have some element of intentional spiritual formation. So teaching and learning, some of that's around church history, some of that's around community organizing practices and sort of more political orientations that some of the organizations have, and some of them are more contemplative. There's a lot of retreats, a lot of time spent in monasteries through these programs. But like I said earlier, like I was in 3 different Episcopal Service Corp programs in my time, and each for a year's time, and they were all very different. And of course, now I am the program director of the Service Corps program, and it's also very different. So it takes on the character of the locality. I know that's one of the things you're interested in. It takes on the character of the place it's in, but also the character of the people who found it, and the folks who arrived there.
And so in a minute, I'd love to dig into the different ones that you've experienced. But in terms of you saying it taking on the character of the people who found it and the locality, do people found the community then ask for Episcopal Service Corps accreditation, as it were, and then become part of this network? Is that how it works?
Yeah, so the program, the network's been around for a while, and there are different ways in which organizations come in and out of the collective organization, but we're moving more towards a model where people sort of have this interest in an Episcopal Service Corps community. Usually it's a priest or a bishop who had some experience in Episcopal Service Corps. So for instance, I'm here in Indianapolis, and the bishop in Indianapolis was in the Service Corps when she was younger, and so she's really gung-ho about it, and she understands the experience. And so usually it happens in that way, where a congregation in the program I'm currently the director of, we had some parishioners, and the priest said, "Hey, we heard about this Episcopal Service Corps thing. We're really interested in getting deeper into a relationship with young adults. We have this property. So how do we sort of and so people put a program together. There's a lot of grant searching. Then there's a process with the National Episcopal Service Corps sort of board to see whether or not it's viable. Because these programs some of them have been around 15, 20 years, and some of them, like mine, is brand new, and these programs start and they rise and they fall, and it just depends on the support that it has around it. Hope that answers.
Yeah. And so the national network, for example, is recruitment organised at the national level? Is funding organised at the national level? And is there a sense of in what way does the network, for example, support you as a new community? Is there that level of support? I realize that's 3 questions in one, but
well, once again, though, you could be in these advisory board meetings, because a lot of what's happening is conversations around that. So, and it's very sort of characteristic Episcopalian in the sense that it's a devolved confederacy. So each of these programs sort of does its own financing, and to some extent writes its own rules. And it's only in the last 5-10 years that the Episcopal Church, the National Episcopal Church, has decided to fully include the Episcopal Service Corps in its budget and as a part of what it does. That's a fairly new movement, because it started off as different groups and organizations deciding that they wanted the autonomy to sort of do their own thing. So we do have a national office, and our national officer, and as I said, an advisory board. And the things that the sort of national office does is supports, in the sense of like saying, hey, here's some grants maybe you can apply for. It provides some national standards, because, I mean, as you're probably discovering in your adventures through intentional communities, these things can get weird if there's not enough sort of oversight, people paying attention. And so these national standards help Episcopal Service Corp communities know like what's healthy and what's good. And when there's sort of a sense that maybe there's something that's not as good or not as healthy going on, the national office can sort of send someone from the advisory board to go check it out, and we run through a checklist and talk to people in these communities just to make sure everything is kosher, both from a level of like whether or not the community is healthy, but also whether or not these things are sustainable. Because these are very resource intensive sort of endeavors. Recruitment does happen through the national office, and so when someone applies to an Episcopal Service Corps program, they apply not just to one, but they apply to like 5. And you have to apply to more than one. You have to apply to more than one. So you go through the national office to apply, and you apply usually up to 5, no less than 3. And then you go through a process. The young adults go through a process of talking to different program directors and visiting different programs to try to figure out what's the best fit. And as I was saying earlier, like a lot of these programs are very different. And so it is helpful to have this larger discernment process to figure out where people need to be, what's the community for people to be.
And so now the national office, is that fully funded, partially funded by the Episcopal Church now?
That's fully funded by the Episcopal Church. So there's a national sort of program director. We're in the process of asking, it's a very complicated thing. So, the Episcopal Church, we're on a 3-year budget cycle. And the way the Episcopal Church works is it's governed by a general convention meeting. The general convention meets every 3 years. It elects a executive council, and they also pass a budget. So the budgeting happens every 3 years.
Cool.
And so so right now we're in the process of getting prepared for the next general convention and asking for an additional officer, someone who can be full-time in recruitment, to go around the country, and sort of a grant maker. So but again, like I said, it's fairly new that this is even in the budget on the National Episcopal Church's radar. And I guess it's partially because the last presiding bishop, or the current presiding bishop, Michael Curry, who is on his way out, was really big into this language around like the Jesus movement, and really big into to figure out how to engage young adults in the church. And so a lot of people see Episcopal Service Corps as a way to engage young adults and get young adults involved in the church. I happen to think it's probably much more than that, but if that image gets bishops to give us money, then good.
Makes sense. And so, up till now we've talked about a bit more about the bigger level, but I'd love to hone in on the individual experiences you've had, just so people can get a sense, and I can get a sense of how the individual communities have operated and the variety in that. So let's start with Atlanta, number 1.
I'll say, so in terms of broad strokes, I'll say that I kind of named the different programs I was in as sort of these different schools, and so the first program I was in, I call it more of a school, an ecclesiastical school, right? The person who formed it, it was formed by a very wealthy Episcopal church in downtown Atlanta, very sort of socially involved church, and the director there talked a lot about what does it mean to be a professional Christian, which in fairness is a phrase that still makes me cringe a bit. But it was sort of geared around working at these nonprofits, doing good work in the world. But the formation was a lot about what is this Episcopal Church thing? What does it mean to show up as a Christian and as an Episcopalian? How do you show up in a way that you can affect positive change? And again, this particular church, these Episcopalians were very professional. So it was a church, for instance, full of judges and lawyers and professors, and so
sounds like Cambridge.
So it was, so you know the vibes, and so it was a wonderful experience. It was not heavy on aspects of prayer. It was not heavy on aspects. We went to church regularly as a community. That was a community of 5 people. We went to church regularly together. And we participated in some of the young adult ministries, but it was much more a focus on what does it mean to do this nonprofit work?
Cool.
How do you, so we did workshops on like grant writing, for instance, and that sort of, it was a school of professional Christianity and a school of ecclesiology. I mean, it's actually my introduction, even though I still look back and I have some sort of issues with that program or its focus. I mean, it's the place where I became an Episcopalian. That's the thing I should note too. Not everybody who is in the Episcopal Service Corps is Episcopalian. But I became Episcopalian through that program, and I fell in love with theology and the liturgy, because that church was also very heady, as you can imagine, with all these doctors or lawyers and professors. There was a lot of like, what is this Anglican theology? So that was the school of professional Christianity and ecclesiology, and I named the next one as in Atlanta as more of a school of love.
Can I go back to the first Atlanta one for a bit? So in terms of very practically, how often were these workshops? Was it a weekly thing or a monthly thing, or like what was the balance between working for the nonprofits and the kind of professional Christian formation?
So again, this is one of those things that across the Episcopal Service Corps are slightly different, but the general idea is people work at a nonprofit 32 hours a week or so, Monday through Thursday most of the times, and then have a Friday, which is for some sort of formation, some sort of intentional input, professional classes, that sort of thing. That it doesn't always shake out like that in the Episcopal Service Corps. So for instance, this first program I was in, our formation was actually on Wednesdays. And it was like sort of midday Wednesday, when the priest could get it, but it's always there. The idea is that 8 hours at least throughout the week is dedicated to some sort of intentional formation.
And then just drawing on conversations that we've previously had about the Episcopal Service Corps, am I right in thinking that a given Episcopal Service Corps community will partner with local charities to provide jobs for the Episcopal Service Corps members? Cool. And then in terms of payment, do you get paid as an individual? Does the community get paid? Interested in the financial model.
You want to get in the weeds. We can get in the weeds here. Yeah. So there are partnerships with nonprofits. So usually whatever the Episcopal Service Corps sponsoring organization is. So sometimes it's a church, sometimes it's a diocese, sometimes it's an independent charity. Will partner, as you said, with local nonprofits. That local nonprofit will pay the church, the diocese, the charity, some amount of money, which is something like, generally the cost is like a third of what a full-time staff member would be. Right. And so generally it's a pretty good deal for them, right? Because they get a full-time staff member for like a third of the cost. And in a lot of the Service Corps communities, this is understood as sort of the missional aspect of the church as well. So you are doing the work of resourcing a nonprofit, hopefully multiplying an impact, usually with someone who is fresh out of college or who is a college graduate who has sort of the skill set and sort of still the energy that comes from a person who's, fresh out of school and believes they can change the world. So they pay for the nonprofit, or will pay for this individual, and the program will take care of the living of the person in the program. So that means like housing usually is covered. So usually there's a house That's covered. A lot of times it's sort of property owned by the church.
Yeah.
So the house, and all the utilities are taken care of by the program. Usually there is a food budget. And again, different programs do this very differently. Sometimes they just give the household X amount of dollars per month and say to whoever's living there, like, work it out, here's the card. Sometimes they give each person an individual sort of food stipend. It just depends on the program. And then each fellow or each person in the program is also given a stipend, generally a pretty small stipend, but a monthly stipend just for incidentals. And usually transportation cost and healthcare are also covered. I mean, healthcare is something that, particularly in the American context, is very covered. And so it's different depending on where you go. A lot of the programs like to frame this, and generally, and I try to be much more honest in my program, but a lot of programs try to frame this as like solidarity with the poor, right? And what does it mean to live in solidarity with the poor? And a lot of times it's probably appropriate because many folks who end up in these programs come from fairly privileged backgrounds, and are for the first time living on this sort of tiny budget. And so a lot of programs frame this in this way in terms of solidarity with the poor. I just think it's sort of an economic necessity to make it work, actually. And I try to be honest with people about that, particularly because also I'm hoping in the program that we're forming here to not be limited to those privileged groups of people who tend to gap year or more familiar with these sorts of things.
Thank you. And you mentioned that the kind of first Atlanta community, you went to church together. Were there rhythms of praying together or eating together? What was the kind of community life between the five of you?
Yeah, and so in that first program, we very much were left to develop all of that ourselves. And it was like, you figure out. And so I think if I can think back to those years ago, it was, I think we had one meal, like an actual meal together a week that we do. And we experimented with different sort of forms of prayer. Because the other aspect I should name this too is also as a part of these programs, you're supposed to also have like one house meeting a week to figure out like house things. And generally that's where we stuck in a lot of the prayer stuff, right? And so we would have time for reconciliation is what we called it at the time. I didn't think that's what we knew we were attempting to do, but that's what we were trying to do, to create this space to be like, hey, here's the issue I have with you this week. This is the thing that's been pissing me off. Please wash the dishes, that sort of space. And we generally do some sort of prayer. We would, people would trade off who would do some sort of prayer practice. But that one, again, wasn't very heavy on the rhythm of life, sort of. And I've named this to you before, but I think in my experience with all these things, I think it comes down to there's all rituals, rhythms, and relationships. And I think that one, the rhythm was pretty off. And I think it's appropriate for at least what it means to be this whole professional Christian idea. Because we were all giving 110% to the nonprofits. And by the end of the day, like, we were always tired. And and also, I mean, a lot of these things are emotionally hard. I mean, particularly the work I was doing at the time, a lot of work I was doing was working with homeless veterans and then people who are just coming out of homelessness. And the work can be draining. Like, you get home and it's like, do you want to pray together? And people are like, no, actually, I don't want to talk to anybody. I just want to go cry in my room, maybe eat, McDonald's burger and watch TV and not think about what I just saw in my job today,
Yeah. Thank you a lot. And so moving on to Atlanta number 2.
Atlanta number 2. The Road is what it was called. Yeah. And I named the Road as I was saying, sort of a school of love. I mean, I loved that program, and I think it's one of those things that really gave me the heart for this intentional community thing, realizing like, oh, this is what this could be. And it was, and this is where I learned too, I think leadership does matter a lot in these sorts of things. And the spirit, the priest, which I'll shout out the Reverend Laura Bryant. I have no idea where she is right now, what she's doing, but I pray for her regularly. She comes to my mind. But creating the spirit, and it was a much larger program. I think there was 10 of us in that program between 2 houses. They were, and the houses were on property owned by the church, which was a mission in a very poor area in Atlanta. And so above this sort of nonprofit, so we lived, you're talking about living in solidarity. It was very real. And this is a place where a lot of rough things happen. You witness a lot of rough things. And I remember one of my fellow members, the first time she heard a gunshot, and she kind of, jumped down to the floor. It's like, what do we do with this gunshot? And it's like, there's nothing to be done. That's just there now. That is a part of the background noise. She, now I think about it, was from Indiana. We're still good friends. We're still friends. Good friends is a lot to ask, but that program was very much, there was a lot of programming and a lot of emphasis was placed on the rhythms there, and the rhythms of how we live together. And so we did things like every week we would sit around in our house meeting and we would think about who in the community we're grateful for and write like letters of gratitude for these people. And we were exposed to all of these different beautiful community leaders around Atlanta, some of whom, again, I still think about. And, I can see their faces in these people who just do this great work. But also it was almost every week, Laura would try to introduce us to a different prayer practice, a different way of relating to the Spirit, and was very careful to try to educate us on the theology of the church, particularly because with that group of people, you have very different theological backgrounds. And so there's a lot of space for just talking and discussing the differences, which was lovely. And I named the School of Love because there was all this intentional work on what does it mean to get to know people? How do you develop spiritual friendships? And I think about, for instance, this closing ritual. There's a lot of rituals as well. A lot of rituals in this program. But one of the last ones was when somebody would leave, and sometimes people left before the full year was sort of over for different reasons. And this happened also when we got to the very end. But everyone would write to this person a letter. But then we would also sit around in a circle and then read the letter to this person. And of course, it's very time consuming to do, to read these letters.
A beautiful thing to do.
Yes, but it was a beautiful thing. And I remember when I was first told about this, I was like, this seems like a ridiculous amount of time. And then you're taking all this time to do this. And like, you write a letter, you give it to the person. These are private things. You don't need to say these, but I remember over time realizing just how precious that space was to hear what people meant to other people, and you realize the things, the relationships that were being formed and the things that were happening that you weren't necessarily a part of, but you could just witness how beautiful that is, right? Because I'm not sharing a room with these two people over there, so they've developed a whole sort of thing that, and a set of things have happened between them, and to be able to witness just that beauty, and one of the things I would say is witness how God was operating through people, for people, it was a consistently beautiful, a beautiful thing. And so I think learning, and we did a lot of that stuff that you do in sort of intentional community stuff, like your Enneagram and your Myers-Briggs and your love language. And but a lot of time and energy was spent on being like, how do you know these people who you live with, right? And how do you care for them? And I continue to look back on that, and now that, of course, I'm a program director, and I'm just like, how did Laura do that? Like, but can think about just the special grace that existed in that place. Yeah.
I feel like I can almost feel it just by the way that you're talking about it. Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Oh, and does that move us on to DC?
DC, man, that was a rough time. And DC is just a rough place in general. Washington, DC, the seat of government, and I will spare you all of my theories and pontifications about all of the spiritual things that are happening in that political place. But I would name that program much more of a just a school of service, right? It was very much heavy on the like the church stuff sort of melted away. Like we lived in a house that was right next to a church, right? So the church stuff was just like, go to the church, right? Like sort of, that was mostly the spiritual sort of aspect of it. But it was more, and so we didn't have like a full day of taking out. It was Monday through Friday, and a lot of people, the need in DC is great. It's and the poverty there I would describe as ferocious, right? And maybe it's something about the juxtaposition of power and wealth with you walk to the Capitol building and you see these people like sitting outside the train station who are poor and homeless, and it just doesn't make sense, right? And so in and of itself, the cognitive dissonance there was draining for me personally.
Yeah.
And I think actually for the other people in the house as well, there was a lot of struggle in that place. Partially our assignments, which my assignment there was also working with homeless teens and young adults. And there was someone else sort of working with homeless teens and young adults, and there's someone else working at a charter school for poor kids, and there was someone else working at sort of a just direct service, social service agency, and another person working at a space for people with HIV/AIDS and sort of navigating, poor people trying to navigate the healthcare system in America. It was just a lot.
And how many people were in that community?
That was, how many did I name? Was that 5?
Okay.
6 people.
In one house?
In one house. Yeah, it was a pretty big house. We all had our own rooms, which also, was different than the previous program, which I described as School of Love, which is, I was actually the only person in that program that had my own. Everybody else shared, and there was one room with like 3 people. Like, there was a lot in those houses. I don't know, the light of the Lord shined upon me. But yeah, so in this program in DC, everybody had their own room. It was just a large house, and this is how a lot of these things happen, right? Is you have an old parsonage that the church is no longer using, and similarly, you have like church, sometimes properties that are just donated by parishioners, and so this was a pretty large house, and we had pretty good space to retreat. Because there was a lot of need for that. Yeah, and I would, again, I think, at least for me personally, I did a lot of good work with a nonprofit there, I think, and spent some of my own time exploring more of the Episcopal Church. Part of what So part of what drew me there in the first place is, I mean, this is like an interview, so you know this, Lakshmi, but I don't know if anybody else does, that I'm Black and in America. So being Black in America and Episcopalian, there's a lot of questions for me about what does it mean to be, as Thurman talks about, the disinherited, and to be a part of the established church. And so a part of what drew me to DC in the first place is that this program was sort of run by a Black Episcopal church, and so I was sort of leaning into trying to figure out what that looks like, and came up against a lot of it. There's a lot of class stuff. There's a lot of elitist stuff when it comes to the Episcopal Church. It's not as true, I'm guessing, with the Church of England and the UK, because it's probably broader. But I mean, if you think about the Episcopal Church in America, it is the remnants of the establishment and the aristocracy. And so, the Episcopal Church built the National Cathedral, right? That overlooks DC, and it's so and it's the cathedral where they have presidential funerals and inaugurations are started in space. And so, at least for me personally, I learned a lot about the Episcopal Church in that space, and some of what it can do with its resources. Also, some things about the culture of the church that holds it back from doing those wonderful things. But that's more than what you're asking me for right now. And yeah, it was a school of service, and I think we served, and for the most part, we did well. And there were a lot of tears, and a lot of anxiety, but we got through it.
Yeah. And so, looking back on all of that experience, and maybe drawing on some of your other experience, which I don't think we have time to cover today, but what would you say are some of the key important components of successful international Christian community, which you want to see in, for example, the community that you're directing now, or any future communities?
Yeah, and I'll name really quickly, just because we don't have time to talk about it, but I'd name also going to the community of St. Anselm in London as a space where I learned a lot, and I'd call that more of a school of prayer, because there was a lot of how to learn to pray, as well as, being a sort of ecumenical school. But it also was a very good alternative examples of what it means to be plunged into this sort of neo-monastic way.
Yeah.
As opposed to the Episcopal Service Corp communities, which are sort of a tiptoe into the new monasticism. It's sort of, if people are interested in experimenting with what does it mean to live in community life, but are not really wanting to commit to that idea. Because it's a hard thing to commit to. Components, and I think naming sort of, I think as I already did name for you, I think it comes down to, it's about rituals, it's about rhythms, and it's relationships. And you, in any intentional community, I think the intentional part is around those sort of places. So how do you intentionally think about what the rhythm of life is for both the community itself, but also for the individuals within the community? And so some of that comes into, do we pray together on Wednesdays? Do we pray together every Monday? Do we pray together every evening? And I'll say this too. I mean, and again, and I didn't get into this sort of all that clearly, but in each of these different programs, there were different attempts and experiments at how do we pray together, and when's the best time to do that, and when's the best day for us to have dinner together? And we have dinner together once a week or 3 times a week. Do we all go to church together and then have Sunday dinner? Is that the best time? What if somebody wants to go to church in the evenings? Like all of these negotiations. But it's about intentionality and creating space for an intentionality around that, because I think we exist in various societies where, I mean, there is a rhythm already dictated for us, and it is capitalistic, it is imperial, it is all of the other isms, it is patriarchal, it is heteronormative, it is, whatever, there's a rhythm and a way dictated. And for me, the thing that distinguishes, particularly if we want to talk about from a particularly Christian perspective, right? I think the thing that distinguishes us is the way, right? When Saul, before he is Paul, is searching for us to persecute, he says, look for the followers of the way. Right? And so there's a way. And I think that's one of the most essential things in establishing, is this just a random group of people living together?
Yeah.
Community. And so the way dictates that, the rhythm dictates that. And then who am I to these people that I live with? Right? And so being intentional about the relationships, I think, is essential. Like it is not, I mean, is this my housemate? Is this my roommate? Is this my friend? Is this my sibling in Christ? Is this my community member? Is this a fellow journeyer on the, traveler on the journey? Like, how do you name your relationship to the people you're living with, next to? Who is my neighbor? Is that my neighbor? Right? What does that mean? Because you can live with people and they be perfect strangers. This is not just true in community. This is true in people's households of origins. People can live to people who are so the intentionality, the desire to I was in my own sort of podcast series when I was sort of, and you might have heard this, I remember interviewing someone who runs Crush Community, a co-housing community in Boston. And he said that for him, he realized like what this intentional community was about was one night he came home, I think it was his birthday or something, some sort of celebration, and he was very drunk. And he sort of went to lay down in his bed and realized like, oh, I'm gonna vomit, and it's just not gonna work. And so he gets up and stumbles out into the hallway, but doesn't make it to the bathroom. And so it's just pukes all over the hallway. And he says his community member comes out and looks at him, and he goes, all right, I got this, go back to bed. Right. And he said for him, that was understanding of like, oh, this is what this community thing is. Because he's like, there's no reason this person has to like clean up my mess or care about right? Like there's no but there was a choice made in that moment that like this becomes my work, my duty, becomes my privilege to care for you. So the intentionality around relationships and last rituals, and I think that's the essential piece of I mean, when you talk about like Christian communities or spiritual communities, what is it? What are the rituals that mark our days and the passage of time, right? And how do we agree upon what those rituals are? And do we have some sort of common understanding of what this ritual is? And if it's sitting around silence for 10 minutes once a week, and if that's your ritual, that's fine. But if there's a way in which that there's a common understanding of why we do that, and how does this connect us to something larger or outside of ourselves, which I also think is important because, I mean, again, these communities can become weirdly insular and strange things can happen. And so you always have to be on the lookout for all of that weirdness. And so I think the rituals, again, if you're intentional about it, call you back to an understanding of what is it that we're doing together. I think, what is it that we believe about what we're doing together? How do we affirm that? And hopefully, if you're intentional, because there are other rituals, like your ritual could be, I come home and again my roommate has left dirty dishes in the sink, and my ritual is to be pissed off about it and wash these dishes, unless it just happens consistently at 6 p.m. every day. And that's a ritual, but that's not like life-giving, right? So being clear about what rituals we have together, I think, is what makes it essential.
Yeah. And just an observation tying some of the stuff that you said about the intentional rhythms that you try and create in community against the rhythms which society are basically dictating for us. And I guess part of my experience in young adult community is that when you're in more of that tiptoe new monastic community, which isn't as kind of enclosed as, say, the community of St. Anselm or being in a monastic order, there's a sense in which these rhythms are competing, and then suddenly it's like, oh yeah, I've got a late shift that night, so I can't do prayer that day. Or like my church service at this time, so I can't pray this day. Yes. Or like, oh, my friends invited me out for drinks, so I can't make this day. And then so for me, that's something that I'm holding when thinking about young adult community, is the balance of the societal rhythms and the rhythms that you're trying to create in community, and how is it that a good balance can be created, because otherwise it can just get too much because you've got clashing rhythms.
And it's a part about, depending on how intense you want to be about it, right? And I think about my time at Holy Cross Monastery, right? And a lot of that was, hey, you make a commitment to pray 7 times a day, regardless of what's going on. So whatever's going on, in the next 7 minutes, the bell's going to ring. You need to be wrapping up what's happening. And how do you maintain a humanity in that? And I think in its ideal form, these communities help us to discern, right? How do I make a call about whether or not I'm just having FOMO right now? So I have made this commitment to pray with these people on Wednesday, but like this whole thing is happening. Versus actually, it's really important for me to be with these people outside of this community, and I can understand the reasons why that is the case. And I'm doing an actual weighing that is beyond just what I feel in the moment. But it is an actual discernment. And I do that with a respect for the people I've made a commitment to. That's the other piece too, right? Like the commitment or the covenantal sort of relationships of living in the household together. And again, these different communities have different levels of this. And another thing I just didn't name about the Service Corps communities is they all have a community covenant, which generally people made at the beginning. So you put down on paper, this is how I expect us to be living together. And which is important, because then we can return to it in a month or 2 months when inevitably we don't live up to this thing, because, we're human, and that's like okay for us to be human. But then we ask ourselves, why are we not living up to this? And is it because we were unrealistic when we put it down? Was it because we've gotten tired and that's actually telling us something else about of our life? Is it because I just don't care enough and I need to reaffirm my commitment to this thing? And it's any number of places. And sometimes, it's just most extreme, we revisit and realize, it's because actually I don't need to be here. Right? The most extreme sort of form. This set of commitments, I initially thought was a good idea, and now that I've lived them for a bit of time, I realize it's not just that I'm, lazy or slothful, or it's not just that I'm willful or controlling or whatever the case might be. We have all those things, right? But it's actually what's on this commitment is something that is actually abridging who I am as a person. It just doesn't work on a fundamental level. When you get to those sort of breaking points, that in and of itself is like beautiful learning, right? For the individual and for the community, like, okay, now I can see who I am, and it's not failure. It's knowledge. And actually, and at that point, if you go that far, it becomes wisdom. Right?
Thank you. And so you've spent a lot of your life in young adult community and are still dedicating your life to young adult community. What is it that you see in young adult community? Why have you dedicated so much of your life to it and continuing to do so?
These are great questions.
I'm glad.
Well, I'll say for a little while, and in particular, this marks the transition from my spending 3 years in Episcopal Service Corp communities to then when I went to London to live in the community of St. Anselm. And I may have told you the story already, but for me, the first 3 years living in Service Corp communities, I was like, okay, this is just cannot do that right now. Sorry. Work is calling. Anyway, I thought to myself, like, this is a convenient way to live. It's making me a better person, right? I can recognize living in these communities in these intentional ways is making me a better person. And so partially, initially, I think that's why I was doing it. In addition to giving me access to places and things, and I think about the house we lived in Atlanta in the first community. I'm like, I could never afford to live in that house. Or similarly in DC, like, oh, good Lord. And so there was sort of access and there was sort of a real practical sort of piece to it. And then I remember very clearly this just sort of gentle whisper when I was at the steps of the Capitol building in DC, when I was considering sort of my next steps. This piece around, it's almost like I heard God saying, sort of, maybe this thing isn't about you, right? Maybe this is about me, and there's something I want you to do for me. Is sort of how I heard it from God, and this opened up something for me about, oh, okay, like this way of living actually is an alternative. Like I can see I'm a person who's sort of deeply attuned to the brokenness in the world, right? And I'm like, I see it real clearly, right? I can walk into a room and see brokenness in the room, right? Like that is one of the gifts and however you want to call it, that my, both from God, but also that my life experience has given me able to see it. And yeah, there's this connection between like, we're just not living right. is the issue, right? This conclusion that I've reached, that the way we have organized ourselves in relation to each other is incorrect. And the way that we transform that is not merely by advocating for certain policy changes in the political process or by shouting in the streets, but it's about going home. I have this I can't see it from here, but in my hallway, sort of African proverb that says the ruin of nation begins in the homes of its people. And there is like, what's going on at home? Like, how are we living? Where are we sleeping? And where are we eating? And who are we talking to? And how are we doing? And what dictates all of it? So there's something that just became clear. Like there's something fundamental going on here, actually. About life together. And so there, and I say, so it's become clear for me, like this, I guess this is the hill I'll die on, right? Like this is the, my contribution, my response to like the Spirit's talking, right? Is on this question about how we live together and think intentional. And I think that word intentional is so important because we live unintentionally, and that's the issue. And in community. And it's, for me, it's also an extension of my attempt, as flawed as it is, to follow Jesus, right? Like these weird communities of belonging that don't actually make sense based on the world's the script we've been given.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But like trying my best to be in service of that dream. And it's also some of it too is, and you get this, some of it's ineffable. Some of it is these little glimpses of a dream that I saw at some point that I'm chasing. And for the most part, I think it's worked out pretty well. Yeah. Hope that answers.
It really does. And I like to point to the significance of the fact that you almost stumbled into it. It was a convenient way to live. And likewise, the way that I landed into Lynn's house was quite just by surprise. And also you mentioning these young adult communities are almost like tiptoe communities, which are maybe, different to fully monastic communities. But for me, there's something about offering a glimpse of that different way of living, which then, feeds people and then sends them out in ways that we can't predict. No one could have predicted that Lynn's house did what it did to me, or what kind of your 3 years, kind of the path that's laid out for you.
Yeah.
So that feels exciting to me, the potential of young adults communities for, essentially, and helping people discover themselves before God.
Yeah.
2 more questions, if that's okay.
That's okay.
So at Lynn's house, it's a community of 3, and yet we still struggle with recruitment, or it's getting better now that we're a bit more established. So you've mentioned much larger houses of kind of 6, 9, and a national network. Do you struggle with recruitment?
Yes. And if you know anyone who would like to come to Indianapolis to live in an intentional community of young adults I am attempting to form into or nurture into a school of reconciliation, you let me know. It's hard. And actually it's it's across the board. And I've been in conversations with folks when I was in England, and we were talking about the community of St. Anselm, and there was like, the recruitment was hard for the community of St. Anselm. And it's like, I don't know what's going on. People like don't want to go live in a palace, right? Like what's going on? and recruitment was hard for the Cornula community, Ireland, and across the board here. And even when I was when I was living at Holy Cross Monastery, they were talking about the difficulties of recruiting for monasticism.
Yeah.
There is something happening. A part of what I think might be happening, and this is one theory, is that I think people are already starting to do some of this themselves. And this became really clear to me when I was talking to some friends in DC, in New York City during the pandemic. And they were talking about how they were living together and like how they had sort of developed during this weird time that we were all in. COVID times, wasn't that crazy? That was a whole thing that I think we are just now fully reconciling with. But and I said to my friend, I was like, oh, you're like living in an intentional community. Right? And she was like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, what are you talking about? What is this term? And more as I hear my friends and how they are adapting to the economics they find themselves in. There is, on the one hand, there is this fearful response to the present environment. People are afraid, particularly in this country. People are in debt. People like got to figure it out, like they're, and also like the knowledge of what seems like the knowledge of the world crumbling daily, right?
Yeah.
And so people are retreating, but unintentionally into community. I think there's one piece that's happening already. Another piece I just say to my colleagues in the Service Corps work is, generationally, I don't think people need to be told that they need to do something about the problems of this world. I think people, particularly young adults now, are quite aware. And so programs or the models like Episcopal Service Corp, which are structured and sold as a year of service is not actually the thing anymore. People don't need to do a year of service. Like, this is going to be the rest. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to figure out how to undo the damage to the global climate. Like, I don't need a year of service, right?
Yeah.
But I do think people need community and belonging, but it's hard to figure out how to package that in a way that doesn't scare people as well.
Yeah.
Because does your community mean control? Right. And this
less
is
freedom.
What did you say? Less freedom. Yeah, less freedom, and to some extent, yes. And we have to be honest about that.
Yeah.
And try to figure out how to communicate to people why that's actually a good thing.
Yeah. And I'd say,
no, go ahead.
kind of a theory that I would hold would be that it's a countercultural way of living which people aren't really fully aware of, and therefore don't really know. As in, we both kind of stumbled into it kind of by accident, as it were. And so it's not something that you pursue, because it's not like, oh yeah, I become a doctor, I become a lawyer. It's like, oh, this weird thing which I haven't thought about. So people don't necessarily know what they're missing, as it were.
Well, I think this is where, like, podcasts, for instance, are helpful. People get to learn about things. I think also we just need 1 or 2 really good reality TV shows, right? That like document what's happening here, and that is the development of an alternative. And yet there's a part of me that says the fact that it's semi a secret, right, is not the worst thing, because if it weren't, the powers and principalities would try to stamp it out if there was a true understanding of what the potential of living in intentional community is, right? I think about these studies of the Soviet Union and pre-breakup of the Soviet Union, and how people were dealing with authoritarian regimes in the USSR, and the way in which they actualized at the dinner table an alternative, right, to the authoritarian reality. There's a great book by, I think it's Jeffrey Goldfarb, called The Politics of Small Things. And this is deeply spiritual. It's deeply political in the same way that Jesus was deeply spiritual and deeply political. I'm going to do this one thing and it'll change everything. I'll forgive sins. I will unleash right, the way in which we have been locked into a pattern of behavior and relating, which produces evil. And here's this alternative. And it's not to say that it is perfect, because it's not. I mean, in community, you know this, but the other piece I'll say is I'm thinking a lot about monasticism, and monasticism scares people because of their historic obsession with sexuality, right? And I mean, it's the church in general, though. The church has had a historic obsession with sexuality, and it's weird, and we finally just need to collectively all call it what it was, and what it still is, and this deep discomfort, this some of it misguided understandings as a result of Platonic dualism and all this sort of stuff, right? Like we see it for what it is now, and now people like are they want to keep an arm's distance from anything that seems to be those sorts of distorted understandings of gender and sexuality, and not to say that they're all wrong, because they're not all wrong, but they're scary to people. And I don't know. I mean, for me, it's living alongside. Because I'm weird and I had an interest, so I want to go to a monastery and live and see what these people are doing. I know that it's actually much more human than what it is portrayed to be.
Yeah, likewise.
But I know how people see it, and so and that's the last piece I'll say too is just for me, there's this sense that monastics and are monasteries and convents are like these fortresses and they're like sitting on these huge armories, and and it's like there's like battle raging outside, and they have like all of these tools and weapons that like people need for the battle outside. And like, how do you figure out how to like knock on the doors and be like, okay, we kind of need the thing you've been sitting on for like 1,000 years or 800 years or 500, 200 years, thing you've been sitting on. And it's a whole other set of questions and struggles to figure out how to actually access what they've been sitting on. Yeah. Because inside of those fortresses, they're also humans too.
Yeah. I guess that's part of the new monastic movement, is trying to draw from what these communities have been sitting on. Yeah.
But there's a huge resentment. We get into in some of these monastic communities to even the usage of a term new monasticism or some of what's going on there. And humans on both sides.
Yes. I think we're heading up close to the hour, but I have, 2 more questions.
That makes 3, but I'm here for it. It's fine. I'll dwell with you as long as you would like.
Thank you. Penultimate question. From all your community experience, what are some of the key things which you're trying to bring to the community that you're currently director of?
Love. I a part of when I was interviewing for this job, and and all interviews I think are mutual discernments if they're real. And I asked the board, how would they feel if, and this is one of those questions that actually just kind of, sometimes questions arise from the gut, they just come out. And so it's kind of like, oh, I needed to hear that question. And I asked them, how would they feel if at the end of a year, these young adults living here, the only thing that happened is that they just felt loved? Right? And I was like, would that be enough? And a part of that was, the advisory board, then, the board and the folks that were hiring me were talking to all these things. We have all these big dreams and all these things that'll happen. And no, what if they just like feel loved? And the pregnant pause was telling. But then people got around to like, yeah, I guess that would be good, right? I guess that would be good. So for me, like there's a lot of complex stuff I think I'm trying to do. But when I get down to root, I'm like, if people just come through a thing and just felt loved over the course of a year, like mission accomplished.
Yeah.
Because that's a part of what's lacking.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That and peace. Now, on a more complex level, I am trying to, as I said sort of earlier, figure out how to build a school of reconciliation, how to equip people with the tools to be reconciling leaders. Because I think that's really what we need too, is people who can see conflict and make an intentional decision to transform it, not just to join it. And a lot of the problems I think we see in the world, a lot of the problems I think we see in American society is, and I think this is true in the UK as well from the time I spent there, the world has just become overly complex. It's become more complex than the tools we have to deal with. And so we need to figure out how to equip people with new linguistic technologies, new spiritual technologies, new emotional technologies to keep up. And I think that's all it is. I don't think, and I know like people like freak out, and sometimes in my moments of deep depression, I freak out too. But for me, I'm like, I think that's all it is actually. It's like we just need like an upgrade in the operating system to deal with the complexity of reality. And once we get that, like, it's okay. We will be okay. We will solve the problems. Like we will allow the florists, to grow, and we will stem the tide of climate change, and we will deal with with racism and sexism and all of the gender issues that we have and all of the sexuality issues. Like we can deal with this stuff. It's just we don't have the tools. And it's not that they don't exist, it's just that they exist on the periphery. Right?
Yeah.
And so a part of my question is figuring out how do you invite them into the center. And some of that, the periphery, one of the peripheries would be a place like, where we met, Rose Castle, on the border somewhere, and these people who are like working on these like habits of a reconciler, like thinking about how to, like it's out there, and there are these organizations that are just spread out throughout the world where people are like just doing this work in communities. I've seen it, I've witnessed it. There are places like monasteries where like, figuring out how to, became my first interest with monasteries. It's like, these people have been trying to figure out for centuries, how do you just get along with people you don't actually like? Like, how do you, right? Like these guys have been, and so the Benedictines and the Franciscans and the Dominicans and the Port Clares and all, they probably have some sort of technologies to figure out how do you deal with the fact that you don't love your neighbor today. But how do we still work together to make sure the crops or the poor children are fed or whatever it is? The manuscripts are translated, right? Like they've been figuring this for a long time. So it exists, and I'm interested in the community we're developing here. So like, can you sort of invite some of those resources and those margins into one place? Can you then embed them in through formation, sort of intentional formation, but also in a rule of life, in a community covenant, in the language that people use as they're speaking together? And I'll just leave you with one example, which is a pretty silly example, I think. Actually, you have like 4 more questions, but
no, just the one.
Just the one. But this is when I talk about like linguistic technologies, right? A part of me, I used to, you don't need all that backstory. So for like one facilitation technique, right, is something called the oops out rule, which I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but it's like when you're in the midst of like a difficult facilitated conversation, right? If someone says something that offends you in a deep way, right, you can just say in that room something like ouch, right? And the person who is speaking then pauses for a moment. And if they can understand why that might have offended you, they can say, oops, and then you can move on. And if they don't, then they can say, I don't understand what just happened, right? Now, this obviously is weird and clunky, right, as a way of sort of facilitating the thing. That's the sort of we need those sorts of, when I call technologies, ways of being together that will help us navigate the more complex conversations we have to have. The conversations are so complex. Maybe I can't pause every time to have a long conversation about everything I said that might have offended you. And maybe you don't always have the words to fully explain why that offended you. But maybe all you need to know is that I see you as a human being, right? I'm doing my best, and I see you doing your best, and we're carrying our stuff, right? But we need to arrive at a certain place. So we need to do that together, right? We need these sorts of seemingly corny, maybe innocuous ways of relating to each other. And those need to become embedded in our daily living. And then I think we can negotiate, and I think we'll be all right once we figure out these sorts of things.
Thank you. And now for the final question. I promise. So this podcast is called Dwelling Place, making reference to communities as particularly special places of God's dwelling. So where or how is it that God dwells in community for you?
Well, a bunch of places. So I'll start with my weirdness, is that I think God dwells in like potential, possibility, in the moment before we speak. right? When people are just physically in a space together and nobody says anything yet, or there's not an initiative yet. There's just a moment just before. I think God definitely dwells in that space. I think God dwells in the sort of seems pretty obvious, but we have all these broken spaces, and when the moment happens where one person's broken space touches against another person's broken space, and it's almost like static that takes place, right? And there's some acknowledgement, some recognition, some potential for healing that occurs. God dwells there. God dwells. One of the, and this is why I was chuckling, because the first thing that came to mind was in that school of love that I lived in that community. One night, basically, there was a series of like robberies in that community. It was a pretty rough community. And one night, someone broke into our home, which of course leads to a lot of fear and vulnerability, like that changes your relationship to your home. And I know that God was dwelling in a space where one of Isaiah, God bless Isaiah, was like, we need to build a fort. And that night, after all this happened and the police are there and blah, 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 all these things happen. And no one really just wants to go to their room alone, right? No one wants to do the thing that's happening. And so Isaiah's like, we're going to build a pillow fort. Now, we're all adults. But what that means is that we can build a dope pillow fort. Like as adults, with all these blankets hanging from the ceilings, and we build and constructed everybody, just all these, people focus their energy on building this like fort in this large living room we have. And then we all crawled in and we ate snacks. And then somebody extended the TV and we watched some sort of Disney movie, and everybody just fell asleep watching this Disney movie. God dwelled there in that pillow fort, right? Because that was like, and it was safety, and it was comfort, and it was togetherness, and it was joy, and fun, right? God, I mean, it is the basic, when two or more are gathered, or two or three are gathered. There's just all of these moments when community is happening, in whatever form it's happening, and sometimes in the most tragic forms. But God dwells. God dwells there. Yeah.
On that note, that brings us to an end. Thank you so much.
Thank you.